Oh, all right. Moish, what are we listening to? Okay. All right. So let's just back up. We'll start Siman Zion again because we really just got our feet wet. And then I showed you the Aruch HaShulchan, who sort of equivocates, and he says that you have to, if we talk using money for tzedakah to support family members, especially your children, is something that you can clearly justify, because once your child is 6 years and older, you are no longer halachically obligated to spend money on their sustenance. According the way that it used to work in the times of the Gemara, is that once a kid was 6 years old, the father would say, okay, you've lived here long enough, time for you to get a job. There was no such thing as child labor laws, right? Yeah. So therefore the poskim say that based on that, you have every right to take the money that you spend on your children who are 6 and older and say, I'm being charitable with them. Out of the goodness of my heart, I want my children to grow up and have a nice, wholesome upbringing, but that's part of the tzedakah. So he says, Ein l'shalem banav mizanos banav migil sheish umata mikasbei maser. So the first thing is, if they're under 6, you cannot use your meiser money to support your children. But umei al gil sheish nechlaku ha-poskim. But once they reach 6 years old, then there's a machlokas in the poskim. Yesh matirim l'shalem mikasbei maaser. Some say it's completely okay to use your meiser money. The yesh osrim, and some say that you cannot. And remember, the Aruch HaShulchan had quoted the Gemara that Tavo Me'era, may a curse befall anyone who uses his tzedakah money, who uses his ma'aser to support his children. Gemara doesn't say ma'aser money. And so the Aruch HaShulchan says, how could anyone justify a practice for which the Gemara says you get a curse? And the Aruch HaShulchan answered that perhaps what the Gemara is talking about is the agricultural tithes. In other words, that is conspicuously segregated for the poor. Or it says, your meiser ani, it says. Anyone who uses their tithes for the poor, that has been set aside in your granary for the poor, that you should not use for your children, because there it's conspicuous that you're deducting from the poor to give to your children. But if it's income that's in the bank, you certainly have justification, he says, and you wouldn't get the curse. And then finally, he says, V'yesh mishosa pshara ben shtei deos eila. Some, like the Aruch HaShulchan, makes a compromise position. Because remember, the Aruch HaShulchan said, you can certainly justify using your meiser money for supporting your children and your parents, if your parents need financial support, and other family members. However, if you're going to use all of your meiser money for that purpose, no charitable institutions will end up being supported, because you won't have any meiser money left. If you use all of your meiser money for your children's tuition, food, room, and board, and all of the other things that you pay for, there won't be anything left for other charities, right? And therefore, uposek shirashai l'shalem mikasbei maser rak chelek mimizonos banav. And therefore, you should only use a percentage, which is, the percentage is not identified, but a percentage of your meiser money can certainly be used for tuitions and costs, living expenses for your adult children and so forth. V'yesh omrim shenochem lahachmir v'rak mi shadachuk b'parnasa so rashai lahakel. And then finally, you have this opinion that says only someone who's hard pressed for cash should rely on this heter. And he quotes the Birkei Yosef, the Pele Yoetz, the Minchas Yitzchak, and a whole bunch of other people. So I just want to, point out that this is a classic example of how the laws of tzedakah are so elusive as far as pinning down a definitive psak, because it's so subjective, and a person can always say, can always justify in a very real way, not just like a rationalization, but a real justification. Look, I've for this year, I got this kid in university, I got this kid in yeshiva, I got this kid in kollel. My daughter's husband is not making enough to pay their mortgage, and right, I've got all of these family expenses. I can certainly justify not giving 10% of my income, of my net income, to other tzedakos, but you got to leave something over for the community institutions and to support the real, the poor that are not members of your family, because otherwise you're going to be losing out on the mitzvah. Okay, so how much that is, that's up to the individual to make that decision. Yeah.
That means any and all in the most Bible change. Shara means any one of them.
Well, the term peshara means compromise. So we use the term peshara to refer to judgment in Batei Din. And that usually means to try to find something in the middle that will satisfy both parties. But peshara over here means compromise between the two opinions and come to an amount that you feel is reasonable that you give to outside tzedakah other than your family. But it doesn't necessarily have to be, there is no middle position here. It's not, we're not suggesting that it should be 50% for your kids and 50% for outside tzedakah, because what if you earn $100,000 a year and your children's financial needs are $40,000 a year, right? That's well beyond whatever money you would tithe for tzedakah. So to say, well, then I should only give half of my Meiser money to my children and the other half. No, that's not what we're saying. Maybe the correct peshara is 80% of you, whatever you feel is reasonable. Let me also point out that this is also another reason why parents should encourage their children to get jobs and go to work, is because if we create a situation where our adult children, oh my gosh, I just realized that this is not working. Maybe that's the reason why the screen's not on. I mean, they can see the screen in TV land, but you guys can't see it. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. But so what I was saying is that this is another reason to argue why it's important for parents to encourage their children to become self-sufficient as soon as possible. In other words, a parent could say to his children, I love you and I'm happy to support you, but I'd like to start supporting other charitable institutions other than my own family. And a parent, I mean, I think that's a valid thing, for a parent to say, listen, I've spent the bulk of my adult life supporting my children. That's been my justification as to why I'm not giving large gifts to charity. But I'd like to start giving large gifts to charity and being a philanthropist, but I can't do so if I have to keep supporting you. So please, by all means, it's time for you to move on and stand on your own 2 feet. But anyway.
A real struggle going on now in the world of maybe we're creating about this idea where things that are sort of collapse. I don't know which generation. This generation.
It's not going to collapse. It's not going to collapse. No, because the Haredi world has figured out how to make a lot of money. So it's not going to collapse. There may be in what's fascinating, and I will make this commentary. the Haredi world in North America and in other parts in Europe and so forth has come to the realization that the goal is not to spend your entire life in Kollel, but the goal is rather to develop a significant number of years for a young man to learn in Kollel, and then to become as wealthy as possible. And wealth is a value that is extolled now in the Haredi world, and it's an interesting evolution. Wealth was not as much held in such high regard as it is today. I would say this is a 21st century phenomenon, just in the last quarter century. Well, he's not in his 40s, he's in his 30s, let's say. And what he does is that he goes to work for someone who's extremely wealthy and who is in real estate management or is in the old age home business. Those are the primary two big industries that Haredi young men are going into today. And they can become very, very successful. And the push for these young men is make a lot of money so that you can afford the frum lifestyle and that you can support the institutions. That's the value that's now been pushed in North America. And I think, personally, I think that's a very positive development. But obviously, with every positive development, you get some negative fallout as well. So that there are some people who have taken that new message of become wealthy to overdo it, to live to excess. All right, so that's just, but overall, I think that this has been a very, very positive thing. Now, and you can see that in Toronto. You can see that the wealthiest families in the Jewish community in Toronto are from the Haredi community. And that's to the disadvantage of, let's say, institutions that maybe don't fall under the rubric of strictly Haredi. That, not as many people, we have to be self-sufficient because they're supporting other institutions. Now, with all of that said, take a look at what's happening in Eretz Yisrael. That message that extols the virtue of wealth has not trickled down as powerfully in the Haredi world in Eretz Yisrael. As a matter of fact, it's still the old school of pas b'melach tochal umayim b'mesura tishta, like eat bread with dipped in salt and drink water from a cistern, the al haaretz tishan, and sleep on the floor and live a life of meager existence as a virtue is still upheld in certain communities in Eretz Yisrael. And that's what's fascinating, is that when you look at the growth of Aliyah in the religious world, why are you seeing it primarily coming from the non-Haredi world? One of the factors is that when a Haredi Jew from North America sees how his counterpart lives in Eretz Yisrael, he's saying to himself, why would I want to make Aliyah to live as a schlepper, as a pauper? I'd rather have a Haredi lifestyle in North America and have a nice big house with a swimming pool and live life with luxury instead of going to Kiryat Sefer or Beitar or one of these communities where everyone's cramped and no one has money and constantly borrowing from Peter to pay Paul and so forth and so on. So that's the reason why we're seeing actually a reduction in Aliyah in the Haredi world, but an increase of Aliyah in, let's say, perhaps what we would call the non-Haredi Orthodox world. Okay. In the non-Haredi world, wealth is also a virtue in Eretz Yisrael, right? There's a lot of opportunity, a lot of high tech, a lot of other great opportunities in Eretz Yisrael for someone who wants to live, who wants to fulfill that mitzvah and be part of the Jewish nation. Okay. Good. So this is the whole issue of supporting one's children. So number 2, yesh poskim shebimakomos shehachok mechayev lefarnes es banav lemishmei al gil sheish. He says there are poskim who say that if the law of the land requires you to support your children above the age of 6, then l'chol hadeos asur l'shalem parnasasa mikaspi meiser. Then you would not be allowed to use your meiser money to support your children. Why? Kaven shebalav hachi chayv lefarnasam al pi hachok, because the government requires you to do that, and so therefore it's part of what is expected of you as a citizen of the state to take care of your children. How then can you view it as charity? This is an interesting shita, and it's logical when you think about it. This is from the Sefer, it's from a Sefer in the name of Rav Shlomo Zalman, and it's from Rav Moshe as well. Yesh poskim shein lehitchashev b'chok. And then there are other poskim who say, no, just because the government requires it doesn't affect the fact that I'm still being charitable by supporting my children over a certain age. Okay, so you have this machlokes as well, based on Dina de Malchus. And let me point out that even if you're going to take the more stringent opinion that if the government requires you to support your children, you cannot use their support for Mos Meiser. Let's also realize that the government doesn't require you to send your child to a private school. So whatever tuition you're paying for private education can certainly be taken out of Mos Meiser. And I think arguably we would agree that when you look at the totality of how much money you spend on your children, you're spending it on tuition, on camp in the summer, and those are the big price tag items. And food and board are, you got to buy food anyway for yourself and your wife. So it's not as, right, doesn't compare. There, yeah, it's well, there is one of the things I was at the Chazon Ish who met with Ben Gurion and asked him for 4 things. I was just listening to a podcast of this. I don't think maybe it was the Chazon Ish. One of the things that he had asked from Ben Gurion at the very beginning of the state was, give us an opportunity to have our own schools. We want our own schools. And Ben Gurion allowed that. And so you do have an independent network of schools, the Chinuch Atzmai system, and the Chadorim, who do get subsidized by the government, but are not fully subsidized. So therefore parents pay a tuition, but it's a paltry number. It's like a month. Yeah. So if you're paying 1,200 shekels a year, what is that, like $300, $500, whatever? Yeah.
That's an incentive for North American grading to go there, not pay 100,000 tuition.
Yeah, but it doesn't work that way. They're not gonna make the living in order. It's attached.
Save money on tuition.
Well, I can tell you, my niece made Aliyah for that reason, and her husband works for an old age home corporation in Lakewood, and lives in Ramat Eshkol, and makes American hours. Their cost of living is a fraction of what it would be if they stayed in the 5 towns, and that was one of their incentives. Yeah, whatever it is, yeah. So it works for some guys, Yeah. Okay, next. If a person has ample funds to support his children, or wishes to take the more stringent opinion of those poskim who say that you should not use your meiser money to support your children, so even after you've provided them their basic needs, you want to give them extra funds that, let's say, they don't have, and you want to use your meiser money. Kagon mamtakim, let's say, sweets. In other words, I've given my children their basic provisions, right? Let's say I have a son who's in yeshiva, or I have a son who's in university, and I pay his room and board, and I want to give him a gift for his birthday, or I want to send him shalach manas for Purim, right? In below kaspe hamaiser ein biyacholta lahosif lahem. So this is the gravy of what my basic support of my child is. So if I can't afford it unless I dip into my meiser money, mutter li ishtamish bekaspe hamaiser kedei lahosif lahem, then everyone would agree that you could use your meiser money to do sort of the stuff that's the non-essential stuff. Okay. Next. Yesh mi shaposek shabanot halomdot bevatei chinuch lahanhigam b'derech yeshara. He says, what about girls? Girls who are going to the Beis Yaakov, they're going to whatever school they're going to, and you're paying for their tuition so that they'll learn how to grow up as nice from girls. Efshel l'shalem et schar halimet shalahem mikaspe ma'aser. So you can pay their tuition from your meiser money. Ach mikzaot shenidrashim ve'inam mishum derech yeshara ka'anglit u'chedome otam eino rishai l'shalem mikaspe ma'aser. But let's say subjects that are needed for their self-sufficiency, right? Which a parent is obligated. The Gemara in Kiddushin says that a parent is obligated to teach their child to become self-sufficient. You have to teach your child a trade. And for a girl, you have to teach her self-sufficiency as well. Let's say there are subjects that they're taking in school that are required subjects and are not there to help guide them and raise them in Torah values, such as having them learn English in Israeli school. Those you're not allowed to use your meiser money to pay for because those are not essentials, and it's not considered an act of charity to pay for someone's learning of English. Ela shekashe lechashev maha chelek mitoch schar halimud shemishalmim lemiktzot eila. The difficulty becomes how do you calculate? How do you separate out how much you're paying of the tuition is going towards their learning math and English, and how much of their tuition is going to pay for their religious upbringing and their values? It's very difficult because a lot of times, even in English class, they're learning good values. Others say that you shouldn't use your meiser money to pay for your daughter's tuition. Which, by the way, sounds to me, and that sounds, I give a knee-jerk negative reaction to that. If you can use your son's yeshiva tuition from meiser money, so why can't you do that for your daughters? Okay, not sure. Let's see, is he quoting over here? He's quoting V'hatam mishum shehu chayv al pi chok lahachnis pito beveit sefer. Rav Moshe says, since you're obligated to educate her anyway, you can't use your tuition money from tzedakah. But the thing is you could always send her to public school for free. So I'm not sure. Maybe we'll take a look at that tshuva from Rav Moshe next week. V'yesh mi sheposek shafilu im rishai l'shalem mikaspei maaser mikol makom kedai lizkot b'mitzvah lechanech et benotav mikasef shalom. And then there's a third opinion that says that even if you are permitted technically to use your meiser money to pay for your daughter's tuition, there is an independent mitzvah of educating your daughters. And therefore it's better to use your own money so that you sort of get that mitzvah, not viewing it as tzedakah, but rather viewing it as a separate mitzvah, as a parent, getting the mitzvah of expending my own money to educate my daughters. Before the Beis Yaakov system, there was a big problem in the Jewish community before the Beis Yaakov system. Girls were not being educated, and they were leaving Judaism in droves in the early part of the 20th century. Anyway, it was an issue. It was a churban in Poland with girls who grew up from homes. They were living Yiddishkeit. There's a whole bunch of studies that have been done more recently about this topic. Ein l'shalem mikasbei meiser eschar limud banav b'talmud Torah. He says a person should not use his Meiser money to pay for his children's Torah education. She'ikar limudam sham hu Torah shebichtav. He says if the majority of their study is the written Torah, aval mutter l'shalem mikasbei Meiser bishvil malamed prati ani kidei sheyelamed et beno. He says, but you are allowed to pay for a private educator who himself is poor in order to support a Talmud Chacham who's poor. In other words, if I want to support a Talmud Chacham who's poor, I can certainly justify like hiring a tutor for my child, and I can use Meiser money for that. Right, yeah. Yeah. And I think that the reason why you're not supposed to use Meiser money to pay for your child's yeshiva tuition, that he's saying that where he's learning Torah shebichtav, is that because it's the father's obligation already independent of tzedakah to teach your child Torah. V'yesh mi, 1 second, bring up the next one. Shepasak she'im hamatara b'melamed aprati hi lishmor al ramato halimudit shel beno. There's an opinion that says that if the whole objective of hiring a tutor is so that your son can keep up with the rest of the class in his studies, then you're not allowed to use Meiser money because that's part of your obligation already as a father to your son. But if your objective is to have the child excel beyond where the classroom is holding, then you would be allowed to use Meiser money. This is all hair splitting, in my opinion, it doesn't really resonate. And then there's another opinion that says you shouldn't be using Meiser money to pay for a private tutor. That's the Minchas Yitzchak. Yesh poskim shemuter l'shalem schar limud banav b'yeshiva mikasbei Meiser she'ikar limudam sham hu Torah sheba'al peh. So the poskim say that when it comes to Torah sheba'al peh, where you don't have the same obligation as you do to teach them Torah shebichtav, you can certainly use your Meiser money to pay for your children's yeshiva tuition once they get to an age where they're learning mostly Torah sheba'al peh. Ulam chelek mischar halimut shemishalim b'shvil hotzoos achila shtia and lina ein linakot mimaaser. He says, but the amount that you're paying for room and board in the dormitory and for your son's yeshiva, that you shouldn't deduct, because that you'd be paying anyway, according to that opinion that says that you shouldn't use Meiser money for your children's sustenance. Right. Although up to a certain age, they're learning Tanakh, up to a certain age, let's say maybe up to the age of 10. And they're learning Parshat HaShavua and V'yesh poskim she'asur. Other poskim say that you shouldn't use Meiser money to pay for yeshiva tuition. V'yesh poskim she'en l'nakot mi Meiser ala rak im ein ha'yeshiva mechayevet et ha'horim l'shalem. And some poskim say that you can only use Meiser money if the yeshiva does not require parents to pay. Meaning that no, it doesn't exist in North America. It doesn't exist in North America, but maybe places in Eretz Yisrael where they say, look, we get a certain subsidy from the government. If you can pay, good. If you can't pay, we're not going to require you to fill out any forms. You tell us what you can afford. And so if you voluntarily say, no, I don't want my kid to have a free ride, so then you can use Meiser money. He says if a person has ample sustenance, he should always not use Meiser money. But someone who's got it on a tight budget should not, that person is allowed to be lenient. and to use mice or money for his child's, to pay for the child's tuition. Okay. Well, I mean, tuition committee has to take into account how much the person has. If a person were to say, I'll tell you where it would become relevant. It's a good question, Ron. Let's say a person were to say, look, I can't afford full tuition. I made a pledge to such and such tzedakah that I have to make good on. So the tuition committee could and correctly say to this person, what right do you have to take tzedakah from our institution to give tzedakah to a different institution? You're coming to us and wanting us to be charitable and not require you to pay full tuition so that you can pay a tzedakah pledge. You have an obligation to give your tzedakah towards your children first and to the institutions that are supporting your children. And any tuition committee would be very justified in saying that.